our next speaker is Dr. Patricia Lewis. She's currently the Research Director for International Security at Chatham House in London. Previously, she's been at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies at the Monterey Institute. She was Director of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, as well as the Director of the Verification Technology and Information Center, VERDIC, in London. Her PhD is in nuclear physics from the University of Birmingham, and she's the recipient of the American Physical Society's 2009 Joseph A. Burton Forum Award. I've already given my take on where President Obama is vis-a-vis the nuclear-free world agenda that he embraced at the start of his first administration. And now we'll hear from Patricia Lewis, her take on the promise of global zero. Thank
you. Thank you, Emily. And I want to, first of all, thank INSS and FRS for the invitation to speak. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and very honoured that you're all here to hear what I've got to say, and everyone else. So, I thought about actually renaming my title of my presentation to The Threat or the Promise of Global Zero, because I'm not sure that everybody sees it as a promise. And I think some people are very worried about it, and we're hearing about that, I think, already in the start of the meeting. The conference title itself, though, I have to say, took me right back to my undergraduate mathematical studies, where I loved, and mathematicians in the audience and physicists are now going to think me very strange, but I really loved what was called non-equilibrium statistical dynamics or statistical mechanics, which was really the theory of complexity, or the beginnings of the theory of complexity, and it led into what has become known as chaos theory. And I've often wondered why game theory took such a hold in international relations debates, but not complexity theory and not chaos theory. Because it's obviously much more pertinent in some ways, the issues of complexity and chaos in our international system. So if there are mathematicians in the audience, I'd really be keen in the breaks to talk about how we might look at applying that. And it's in that framing, I think, that we need to think about this. I was quite interested to see Avner Golov's paper on trilateral deterrence, which is really what we would call a three-body problem. And once you start getting into three-body problem, the mathematics starts to get quite interesting. And so the fact that that throws new light on some of these issues is not at all surprising. And if you look at the issue of complexity and the way that we manage complexity in our world, one of the things that you quickly get to understand is that there's no solution as such. What you have is essentially what we have framed in economics, particularly what's called a set of wicked problems. Problems that you can make better or you can make worse. It's not clear at the time exactly what you're doing. And so you sort of tweak the factors within it, and you start to see the direction in which it's going. And you look for the consequences, the interactions in the complex systems. These are what's called complex adaptive systems. And you then start to see what the unintended consequences might be, because that's one of our biggest problems, isn't it, in the international world in which we find ourselves, is trying to understand what not only the consequence of our actions might be, but what we cannot see, what we cannot predict from what we might do. We tend to be very certain in our predictions, and we tend to imagine that the world is as we would like it rather than as it is. And we tend to come up with solutions that will fix things, fix everything, and mostly they don't. And we're lucky if they have any impact at all, and if they have a positive impact, we're luckier still. So, you know, the promise, the so-called promise or the threat of global zero, what is it? Is it where the lion lies down with the lamb? No, absolutely not. Is it a more stable world? No. Is it a less chaotic world? No. It's not less complex. It'll still be full of human beings who will like each other, will hate each other, will get on with each other, will fight each other, all at the same time. Will it be less prone to conflict? Unlikely. Will it be more prone to conflict? I think also unlikely. What's it all about? What is the global zero all about? Well, it's primarily about preventing nuclear war. It's not about preventing war. That's something else. It's about preventing nuclear war. So really where you come out on the issue of global zero is whether or not you think nuclear weapons are likely to be used in war, or whether you think they're not likely to be used in war. That's really where we are. I was asked recently whether or not nuclear disarmament is achievable, feasible, or desirable. And my answer to the question was, it's inevitable. And the reason I think that is that we're going to have to get rid of these things at some point, and the question I have is whether we're going to do it before the next use or after the next use. These are very old, clumsy weapons. They're not the new types of weapons that we need in our arsenals, which are targetable, that can take out specific targets, that can pinpoint targets that we want to cleanly take out and not cause enormous amounts of collateral damage. These are not the type of weapons that we might use in any war that we might want to think about conceivably using today. The first use of these things in the next war is going to be a mess. And it's not going to be those that use them that are going to necessarily be the victors either. Everyone is damaged by the use of such large, clumsy, devastating weapons. You can't make a small mistake with nuclear weapon unless you're targeting something out in a desert somewhere. I'll give you that. If you just want to keep your nuclear arsenals for that and you can prove that that's what they're for, we can have another conversation. But the way in which nuclear weapons have been structured within our forces generally is to create an awful big mess that will have long-term consequences, not only the issue of radiation, which is, frankly, a very small part of the energy in a nuclear explosion, and a time-bound part, but long-term consequences in terms of climate, in terms of things like food production, depending on where these things are used, how they're used, how many are used. There have been many, and there are continuing to be many calculations on all of these things. The long-term humanitarian impact and the impact on our political systems will be upturned and changed, as well as enormous numbers of people killed in a way that would be very hard to put right. These are not weapons in which you can go in and take territory. These are not weapons in which you can go in and win hearts and minds and change the way things. The people will have gone, and those left behind will be in such a terrible state that it will take a hell of a long time. This is not, we're not talking Hiroshima and Nagasaki here, we're talking about something quite different. And that was bad enough. So these sorts of weapons, the very reason that we want to stop other countries from getting them is because we know what damage they can do. And we know the mess that they can leave. And we also know how, as rational as we might imagine leaders to be, there are times when they perhaps are not quite so rational. Mark and I were recently at a meeting in which there was a senior North Korean official, and he was asked, why is North Korea developing nuclear weapons? And his reply was, to deter attack. Right? Now, if we look at the way North Korea behaves at times of crises, or what they imagine or perceive to be crises, it's really hard for us to understand the rationality. It's really hard for us to understand what they think they're gaining by missiles being fired into the sea, or neighboring islands, or small little submersible crafts doing small little recce's and attacks. It's really hard to understand the rationality. And I think in the Northeast Asian region, the fear of the use of nuclear weapons is growing considerably. So, can we rely on rationality when it comes to such weapons use? Can we rely on the other possessing these weapons and their rationality? And Yair thinks, I think, that Iran will prove to be rational actors. I hope you're right if they do develop nuclear weapons. But is that how we're going to rely And one of the problems we have in our discussions on nuclear deterrence is that each time we talk about nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons as a deterrent, as we hear from our North Korean officials, that we are actually driving proliferation. We're driving those that feel insecure to imagine that if they got hold of nuclear weapons, they might be more secure. And I'm not saying that that's going to lead us to a large number of states going for nuclear weapons, but it's certainly a slow, steady rise in the number that are considering it, if not actually developing. And the longer that we talk about nuclear weapons as a deterrent, the more likely we are to cement that in the ways of thinking, and more likely we are to increase their attractiveness to those states that feel most vulnerable. So nuclear weapons are a legacy issue. They are weapons that were developed in another time, in another era, for all sorts of reasons. The vast majority of them were developed in the Cold War, in a particularly dysfunctional relationship between Russia, or the USSR, and the United States. We imagine fondly now that it was stable. It wasn't. And there were many close calls. There were many near use of nuclear weapons. And I'm not going to go into all of those now, but I can do in the Q&A. But it wasn't a stable situation. We can look fondly back through rose-tinted glasses, but for those people who were living through it and those people who were involved in decision-making at the time, they will tell you how often, how unstable it was. And I come to one of my big questions here is, what on earth does strategic stability mean? What does that mean if you unpack it and think about it? What is stable in this world? Not even our climate's stable, right? Our continents, in the long run, aren't stable. This situation in which we're finding ourselves is what I would call a dynamic equilibrium. We find ourselves at points of equilibrium from time to time. And if we imagine that stability, well, that's lovely. And it may be stable for a period of time, but nothing is fully stable. And what you need in any system is the flexibility to find new points of equilibrium. And I think that's where we are now, is we're looking for new points of equilibrium, knowing that the old equilibrium has moved on, and we're no longer there. So where do we find this new point of equilibrium? And one of the questions I have is, do nuclear weapons really deter? Where's the evidence for it? What's the counter-evidence? And what does that mean if we think they do for other countries that don't possess them that might feel vulnerable? Is that where we want to go? If we think they do deter, why are we talking about global zero? Why would we want to get rid of them? Would we want every country to have them? Is that the way that you want to go? I think these are really important questions to ask. And I think the answer to them is possibly they deter in certain circumstances. Probably not in the way we imagine. They often self-deter. And we often don't take action because of fear of them, our own and the possibility of others using them, when it might be better to take action. That's just some of the questions I have about that. And then it comes to extended nuclear deterrence. And does anyone really believe in that? If you were a country that was relying on that for your security, would you really believe in that? And again, I think Avner Golov's paper on trilateral deterrence is extremely interesting in that respect, and I congratulate him on that. Are conventional forces perhaps a more believable deterrent? A determination to use, a willingness to use, a demonstrable situation in which they are used? Do they deter better than nuclear weapons? And are nuclear weapons actually fairly irrelevant for most countries? Do most countries make decisions about interacting with a nuclear weapon possessor irrespective of nuclear weapons? I mean, I look to the 1980s and the crisis in the South Atlantic. Argentina wasn't deterred by British nuclear weapons. Didn't feature quite rightly. Sensibly enough, they said they wouldn't use nuclear weapons to defend the Falklands, and they were quite right about that. Right? So for the most part, countries make decisions about nuclear weapons and tend to discount them as unusable. Whether that would always be the case or not, I wouldn't want to rely on that. But it's a really important question to ask. I think one of the problems that we often do as humans is we come with a tool and then we find almost every situation that we have will somehow use that tool. And that's not a very good way to use these types of tools. They are very clumsy, big tools to use. So what I've been asked to do, I'm getting onto the thing I've really been asked to do, is really look at what's going on in the world of the discussions about zero. And there are a number of issues or processes that are taking place at the moment. Emily mentioned President Obama's Prague speech. And certainly that set in train a number of important things, one of which was the nuclear security summits, which I wouldn't call a disarmament, nuclear zero approach, but it's been an important confidence builder, I think, for a lot of countries. I think as well the bilateral negotiations that took place between Russia and the United States that ended up with New START have been very helpful in lots of other ways, not only in reducing the numbers of nuclear weapons, but also in re-establishing confidence and trust that have led to other sorts of discussions that have taken place under very trying circumstances. The cornerstone, if you like, or somebody in the UN the other day, one of the interpreters called it the corner store, which I found. And actually he said, the corner store which protects us from these terrible nuclear women, which I liked even more. The women of mass destruction. Yes. So it's very interesting listening to the interpretation. That now has what's called a step-by-step action plan that was negotiated in 2010. And anyone who follows these things knows that there's a different set of hopes and expectations within the 185 plus countries of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, 189 countries of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that some want to move ahead more quickly and expected that would happen and demand it. And what others want to, if you like, drag their feet a bit. They were happy to get the agreement in 2010, and they hoped that wouldn't actually mean they had to do anything. And one of the ways in which they're making sure that happens, so that these are the possessive nuclear weapons, is to hold meetings between themselves and blame each other for no progress. And they're called the P5 meetings, which are taking place within the NPT. But they are primarily looking at shared understanding, shared agreement, the issues of transparency, and how they might build on. And this is all what they call the step-by-step process. Now, the trouble with the step-by-step process, as you know, is that we've got a long way to go on this. And these steps are very small. And if you actually look at what they're achieving over recent years, they're not going anywhere. There may even be some backward steps. They rely almost entirely on the Conference on Disarmament, which isn't very smart, because the Conference on Disarmament hasn't actually negotiated anything since 1996. And even then, it couldn't agree. And the treaty that it negotiated, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, couldn't be adopted within the CD and had to be taken to the UN General Assembly by Australia. So relying on the Conference on Disarmament to do the work for you and giving instructions from the Non-Proliferation Treaty to the Conference on Disarmament seems to be rather foolish. And also seems to be unrealistic, because nothing's happening there. We have now a group of experts working on the fissile material cut-off treaty. That may lead to something, who knows? But there's a lot of cynicism about this. There's a lot of concern that the bilateral process between Russia and America is not going anywhere much these days, much further, particularly given the relationship between the two countries and also the incentives that there are for reduction. particularly, I would say, in Russia rather than in the United States. Having said that, I think the chemical weapons issue in Syria was a particularly interesting moment for that relationship. And I know that's not the focus of this talk, but I just want to pause for a moment and think about how both countries put the Chemical Weapons Convention and the determination not to use chemical weapons from the 1925 Geneva Protocol right at the center of that relationship for a while, and made a big difference. It was about upholding international law, but it was also about using an opportunity to implement international law in a conflict and maybe develop it into something else. In the end, it didn't develop into something else, but it was worth a try, and it was a very interesting moment in terms of both countries' commitment to a convention that neither of the countries have fully implemented yet. They're both waiting for completion of the destruction of the chemical weapons stockpiles. The US has moved ahead further than Russia, but they're both still in that process. It also relied on the international system, and we've seen now over 90% of those weapons, of the agents, have been destroyed, moved out, and are undergoing destruction. So it's, by all measures, pretty successful. What's happened is there've been a number of other steps that have taken place. One is called the Openended Working Group, which has come out of this very sober assessment of the fact that the Conference on Disarmament isn't going anywhere. So it set up basically a venue in Geneva to talk about nuclear disarmament under a General Assembly process. And what the difference between a General Assembly process and the Conference on Disarmament is basically two things. One is the Conference on Disarmament is a much smaller body. It's not a UN body. It's 65 countries as opposed to the whole of the UN. And the other is that it operates under what's called the consensus rule, which means that you move at the slowest pace. Whereas the General Assembly does allow for voting, and you can move ahead without everybody agreeing. That, so far, has developed some interesting ideas, and it could be useful for the future. There are some other big ideas. There have been a number of commissions, the Blix Commission, Canberra Commission, the ICNND, and so on, which have all produced useful material and useful ideas, some of which have been built on. The Nuclear Weapons Convention is an idea that has come from non-governmental organizations primarily, with a draft convention that has been circulating for a while. It's got lots and lots of legal and technical issues, problems with it. But it was taken up by Malaysia and Costa Rica and put into the General Assembly, and a lot of countries sort of gather around that. There is the idea of a prohibition or a ban on nuclear weapons, which would be quite similar to the Landmines Convention or the Cluster Munitions Convention, whereby you would essentially prohibit nuclear weapons. Not every country would have to join it at first, and it wouldn't require a huge negotiation. You could even do it without the nuclear weapon states and actually wait for them to come along in later. That has got a lot of NGO uptake, and some key states who really support it, like Mexico. And then there's another initiative, and this is my final illustration of what's going on. And this is probably the most interesting one in terms of the uptake that it's had, and that's called the Humanitarian Impacts of Nuclear Weapons Initiative. And that's primarily an awareness-raising issue. It's a process that has gathered a group of governments, a large group now, growing number. At the last meeting there were 146 countries. Along with civil society experts, civil society activists, international organizations, and looked at what would be the impact of nuclear weapons use. Are countries prepared? Are they able to respond? What's the international community's ability to respond? What would be the humanitarian impact? And one of the reasons that this has come out is that we've been finding a lot of young people don't actually understand what nuclear weapons do. They think it's a bit like Fukushima. They think it's about radiation release, as opposed to the enormous blast and heat that's caused by a nuclear weapons explosion. The education systems that we put in place have forgotten to educate people about what these types of weapons do. And so this has been a really interesting exercise. Nobody quite knows where it will go next. There are those, I think, that would like to take it in the direction of a ban treaty. And there are those who would like to see it lead to a big negotiation for a nuclear weapons convention. I would say that the majority of the states in that initiative are not in that space as yet. I think they want to spend time really thinking through about what the next steps are. I would say that the key issue for them is to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. And how to do that, whether you can do that in the process of going down to zero and put that as a focus, would be, I think, where most of the states would probably come out at. I'm going to end by just saying that I would say that we're in a world in which is unstable, and it will remain so. That is our world. It's history, and it's the future. And as it's not stable, the situation that we're in terms of our power dynamics and those countries that possess nuclear weapons and those that don't, that's not stable either. And we're likely to see the number of nuclear weapons possessors grow over a period of time. I don't want to sound as though that's going to happen tomorrow. It's not. I don't think there's necessarily a tipping point that we can see in the future, but I think it's likely to grow unless we do something about it. So the question I have for you is, what is the world you want? Is it a world in which the number of nuclear weapon states grow, and probably at some point nuclear weapons will be used in conflict, probably in a regional conflict? Is that the world you want? Or is it a world in which nuclear weapons won't be used in conflict, in which case what we have to do, I think, is head towards zero? Thanks.